Hello and welcome to Doc Talk Live. This is NorthBay Healthcare's way of reaching out to the community on important health information. Today, we're going to be talking about genetics and what they can tell you about your health. And with us is NorthBay Healthcare's genetic counselor, Karen Vikstrom. Take it away, Karen.
Thank you, Robin. Today I'll be talking about using genetic testing to guide personalized health screenings. Most of you know that our genes play a role in our overall health. And today I'm going to talk about how you can consider using genetic testing as a health screening tool. Knowing whether you have a higher than average chance to get certain health conditions because of your genetics can help you and your doctors take steps to reduce risk, and especially with certain types of cancers. So in this talk, I'll be focusing on genetic testing for hereditary cancer, but just so you know, genetic tests are available for a variety of conditions, including heart disease and other conditions. So if you have any particular concerns, feel free to shoot me an email and I can answer questions about other conditions as well. And just to have a little fun, we're going to have a couple of pub quiz type questions during this talk. And I think Kelly is going to put those up for us. This will give us a little bit of a history lesson in genetics, and a little context. So the first question, poll question number 1, approximately how many genes do humans have? What's your best guess? I don't know how many people will be able to answer this poll, but I will say whoever answered that number is correct. There are just over 20,000 genes in the human genome. And what's interesting about that is in the year 2021, we only know the function of about 20% of our genome. So 80% of our genes we do not yet understand. The function of the genes is not yet understood. Keep that in mind as we go through this talk. So before we get started, I wanted to go over the 2 main types of genetic tests as they relate to personalized healthcare. First, there is what's called predictive DNA testing, and this is for people who are healthy, but they're interested in genetic testing because they may have a family history of a health condition like cancer or heart disease. Or in some cases, people are adopted and they don't know anything about their family history, so they're interested in genetic testing because maybe that will shed some light on whether they have any inherited risk they didn't know about. And then there are pregnant couples who will sometimes go through carrier screening when they're doing their family planning to learn if they have any genetic alterations that might affect the baby. So there's all sorts of genetic tests out there. And I'll be focusing on just a couple of types tonight. And we're going to compare the predictive testing to diagnostic DNA testing. Diagnostic DNA testing is done when a person is diagnosed with a condition, say, for example, ovarian cancer, and knowing whether there is an alteration in a gene like BRCA1 or BRCA2 or any of the other dozens of genes we test for is helpful because it helps the medical oncologist and the surgeons determine the best treatment options. So when I see patients who've been diagnosed with the cancer, our main goal is to determine whether there is a hereditary link. And excuse me, most cancers, by the way, are not hereditary. And in the next slide, I'll talk about this a little bit more. But the main point to understand with diagnostic DNA testing is it's generally done to guide treatment decisions. So as I mentioned, I'll see patients in our clinic because they've been given a diagnosis. And many of those patients are good candidates for genetic testing. But this pie chart shows what the likelihood is of getting a positive genetic test back for the different types of cancers. So for example, with breast cancer, a woman with breast cancer has about a 10% chance of having a hereditary cause of the cancer. And that's because only about 10% of breast cancers are, in fact, hereditary. The other 90% are caused by environmental factors or sometimes lifestyle or a combination of low risk genes. It's kind of a complicated picture sometimes, but most breast cancers are not hereditary. Compare that to the number you see there for ovarian cancer. Up to 25% of women with ovarian cancer do have a positive genetic test result. The most common genetic findings would be BRCA1 or BRCA2 alterations. And so, in fact, we test all women with ovarian cancer for hereditary cancer conditions because that can also help guide treatment options. And I also wanted to draw your attention to prostate cancer. It's not yet common for men to be offered genetic testing when they have aggressive or metastatic prostate cancer, but in fact, 16% of men do test positive. And the gene that's most common is BRCA2, that same gene that causes breast and ovarian cancer in women. And again, it's good to know a man's genetic status because knowing that can help treatment and the management of prostate cancer. So to sum up this slide, most cancers are not caused by hereditary factors, but for the small percentage, on average it's 10%, knowing your genetic status can help inform medical decisions. So I'm going to switch gears now a bit, and the next few slides I'll be addressing common questions I get about genetic testing. So, and this is a good time if you have any questions to send them to Kelly or Robin in the chat, and they can read those questions out loud to me. So question number one, and this is a pretty common question, is the test that you do the same thing as 23andMe? Are we looking at the same genes? Is it the same kind of level of testing? And the short answer to this is no. And I went to print up my own or take a screenshot of my own 23andMe result to show you. And because they put a disclaimer in their reports about how their test is not appropriate for detecting hereditary cancer conditions. And, but there was an important update they wanted to show me that caught my attention. And apparently they now know I have more Neanderthal DNA than 60% of the other customers. Thought that was kind of funny, that was on the homepage of my dashboard. And it makes me wonder which genes are they? And but anyway, the rest of the report showed that I indeed tested negative for the 3 variants that they screened for in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. And you can see by the, there's only 3 that they're looking at, and they do try to explain in their reports that this test is not adequate because there are over 1,000 variants in the BRCA1 and the BRCA2 genes that you also need to check if you have a personal history of breast or ovarian cancer or a family history. And those are not included in this test. And of course, there's also many other genes that we would test for. So that's the reason why this test is not appropriate and we don't consider it a medical grade test. So question number 2. Can genetic testing tell me if I have a disease or if I'm just at risk for getting a disease? And this is a great question. The answer is predictive DNA testing only lets you know if you are at risk. You can test positive for a gene, but that does not mean that you have cancer, and it does not mean that you're destined to get cancer. It means that you have a higher than average risk because that gene was identified, and the actual risk depends on which gene was found and other factors, lifestyle factors, environmental factors, age. There's all sorts of things that contribute to cancer risk. So genetic testing is not, genes are not your destiny. And it's important to know that when you go, when you think about whether you should get tested. So question number 3, how is genetic testing done? Testing can be done by using a saliva sample collection kit or by drawing blood. I typically use saliva kits now because it's a little bit easier and we don't have to poke people. And because I do mostly video visits now, if a person chooses to get tested, I have the lab send a kit directly to their house. And they take that little plastic tube you see in the picture, they spit into the top. It's just about a teaspoon of saliva that's needed. And once the lab receives that sample in-house, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to get the result. And I do comprehensive testing. Whenever I order a genetic test for hereditary cancer, it's often several dozen genes we will be looking at. I prefer to do the comprehensive approach because you're covering all your bases, you're covering the common genes and the very rare genes that way. So we're almost done. Wanted to leave time for questions tonight. But the one thing I want to address, because I hear this question often enough, is that people will say, why should I get genetic testing? There is nothing I can do about my genes. And why would I do this if the result's going to be my worrying more than I already do? And the answer to that is, if you are identified as having a higher than average risk of cancer, there are steps that can be done to prevent or reduce cancer risk by quite a lot. So for example, if you are identified to have a gene that causes an increased risk of colon cancer, there's a condition called Lynch syndrome. And depending on which gene is found, the average risk goes up quite a bit, from an average risk of 5% in the population to as high, it's fairly high, 20 to 40%. But colonoscopies are very effective at detecting early colon cancers. And likewise, with an increased risk of breast cancer, women are offered 3D mammograms and we alternate those with breast MRIs. They will start mammograms and breast MRIs at an earlier than average age, depending on the gene and the level of risk. And that is very effective at detecting very early stage cancers when they are easy to treat and cure. So, and with prostate cancer, for instance, if a man is identified to carry a gene that puts him at higher risk for prostate cancer, the PSA screening starts earlier than it would otherwise. An average risk man would start at around the age of 50, but we might start as early as 40. So this cancer screenings work, and everyone should continue with their average risk cancer screenings, but when you have an increased risk for certain types of cancers, there are good recommendations in place that will help us find those early or prevent them altogether. Also on the horizon are some new blood tests that are pretty exciting. There is a huge study. It's happening in this country and the UK right now, where they're studying blood samples from people. And these new tests are allowing providers to identify cancers before any other modality would identify them. What happens is the tumors will shed fragments of DNA into the blood, and this test can identify that tumor DNA much earlier than other screening methods. And they also can identify the origin of the cancer, the site. And so these are not ready for prime time yet. They are available commercially, but they're not commonly offered yet. But I think in the next few years, they will be a fantastic tool to use especially for hereditary cancer syndromes. So the key takeaway from this talk is that our goal with genetic testing is to allow you to make more personalized and informed healthcare decisions. As I said, everybody should go ahead with average risk cancer screening recommendations that their primary care doctors recommend. But if you have a family history that concerns you, if you think your family history of cancer might warrant genetic testing, talk to your doctor. And if your doctor refers you to me, we'll discuss your family history and the steps that can be taken to reduce risk and clarify what's going on. And that is it for now. We missed the one poll question, Kelly.
That's what I was just going to say. I think
I'm not sure what happened to it. It didn't show up in my slides, but go ahead and post that if you'd like. Oh, that's what happened. That slide got shuffled around, but I had a slide that said, how much does a hereditary cancer gene test cost? And the answer to that question is, yep, the person who answered that, $250. That is correct. The cost of genetic testing has gone down in recent years. About 10 years ago, it was several $1,000s. And around 2012, it went down to $1,500. And now that same test, which is actually a better test with more genes, is $250 cash pay price. And so if a person's insurance doesn't cover it, it's at least, possibly affordable for more people. And when a person meets testing criteria for genetic testing, the cost is usually under $100. When an insurance company covers the cost, the out-of-pocket for the patient is usually $100 or less. So genetic testing is affordable now. If your insurance company does not cover it, there are direct-to-consumer options available to people. And these labs are indeed good labs. They offer a direct-to-consumer model, so you can sign up for genetic testing on a website and have the saliva sample kit sent to your house, and you essentially get the same test that I do in our clinic. And the cost of that is $250. So that is it for now. Kelly or Robin, do you?
We do. We have a question. Diane is asking, does insurance cover the cost of testing only if you have a risk?
Yes, if you do, so the way we determine whether insurance covers the test is it's based on your personal history or your family history. So for instance, if a woman has breast cancer at the age of 45 or younger, that automatically qualifies her. If she is 50 or younger and she has an additional family member with breast cancer, that also qualifies her. And frankly, the testing criteria are a bit complicated. So when I'm drawing a family tree, I have that running in the back of my mind, whether or not someone meets criteria. When they do meet the NCCN testing criteria, it's a national kind of a standard criteria. Insurance companies generally do cover the cost. And as I said, it's usually everybody's out of pocket is a little different depending on if they've met their deductible, but most of the time that cost of the test is $100 or less.
All right. There's another question too. They're asking, you mentioned that pregnant couples sometimes get genetic testing. What are they testing for? Does insurance cover that? And is it something you do, or are you only focused on cancer related tests?
At NorthBay, I mostly do cancer testing, but I have helped some patients go through what's called carrier screening. Carrier screening looks at several dozen, even some tests even are a couple 100, 300 genes. Carrier screening identifies people who carry a gene. They're healthy because being a carrier does not have any impact on the person's health, but when they partner with somebody who's a carrier for that same condition, then their babies are at risk for that condition. So carrier screening is best done before a couple is pregnant. And I do help people at NorthBay when they ask their doctors, and it just happens that I'm available to help them, and I don't mind helping. I used to do this in my previous job. So if anybody is interested in that, feel free to contact us. I'm hoping at some point we can offer this type of testing at NorthBay. But at this point, I am doing mostly cancer testing.
Okay. You mentioned during the chat that there are 20,000 or more genes in the human genome. Are you looking at specific parts of it? I mean, are there certain markers you're looking for, or do the tests look at the whole stretch of genes?
So it depends on the type of test, but the test that I do in the cancer clinic, the biggest number of genes we can look at is a 91 gene panel. And I typically don't order that many genes because some of the genes on that panel are very new and they're kind of considered research at this point, but the 77 gene panel, step down from that, I do order frequently. And when we do genetic testing, we are only looking at those 77 genes, and all of those genes are involved with cancer pathways. All of those genes in some way or fashion, their job is to code for proteins that keep cells growing at a healthy rate. They tell cells when to start dividing, when to stop dividing. They also are responsible for fixing genetic errors when they occur. So they're all involved in some way with keeping cells growing at a healthy rate. Other types of genetic tests, though, may be looking at a different set of genes. So of that 20,000, there are also genes that involve the function of the heart and, how fast your heart beats. And so there's other panels that focus on heart genes. There's the carrier screening for pregnant couples. Those are a different set of genes entirely. They will sequence genes to see if you're a carrier for an autosomal recessive condition like cystic fibrosis. That's a good example, sickle cell disease. So depending on the type of test, you can just focus on a subset of genes, or there are genetic tests available now where they will sequence your entire genome. That's generally not done, though, unless there's a good reason. It's more expensive for one, and it's usually not a test that's done in terms of trying to find out if you have genetic risk, any kind of genetic risk. So for instance, if you're adopted and you want to know if you have any genetic risk, you wouldn't sequence your whole genome. You would focus on a subset of genes related to cancer, heart, pharmacogenomics, and so on.
Okay. Do you need a referral to get a genetic test, or can anybody just try to make an appointment with you and get it done?
Most people like to use their insurance, so they do request a referral through their primary care doctor. I will see anybody who wants to talk about genetic testing, though, because I am a big believer that there have been too many barriers to genetic testing over the past couple of decades. And just because someone does not meet the standard testing criteria, I will let them know that they don't meet criteria. Their insurance likely won't cover it, but there are still options. And I mentioned earlier that some labs are now offering direct-to-consumer testing. These are really good labs, and I'm comfortable referring people to these labs because they have a staff of genetic counselors who will help them if they test positive. The quality of the test is very good. So I would encourage anybody who's worried about their family history to talk to their primary care doctor first, and they can start that referral process. And if you run into barriers, shoot me an email or give me a call and I can help you find somebody who can help you locate a genetic counselor if it's a subspecialty.
And do most insurance cover genetic testing?
When people meet testing criteria, yes. And you mentioned, or you asked earlier whether carrier screening for pregnant couples is covered. As far as I know, that's not the case yet. Most people pay out of pocket for that, but the test is much less than it used to be now. So that cost is about $250 to screen one person of the partnership. And then if they are identified as a carrier for something, then the testing the partner costs $100. That was the last time we actually haven't tried to bill insurance for the carrier screening in quite a while. Hopefully that will change. It will probably at some point in the future, but it's a lot less expensive to do that screening now.
Okay. Colleen is asking, do you require an in-person consult or virtual?
I am doing telemedicine virtual consults now, have been since COVID broke out, and it's been working out nicely for me and for patients because mostly what I do is talk. I don't really need to see a person physically, and I draw the family tree and we discuss the genetic testing options and the pros and cons. And so the video visits have been working out well.
At some point they have to give a saliva sample though, so they'll have to, or can they mail that in? I don't know.
Yeah, actually I can show you when a person decides to go ahead with the testing, we have a I work with a few labs. This is one of them. And this kit is shipped directly to the house, and it contains this little saliva sample collection kit. And you may have seen the ancestry testing commercials. It's the same exact kit. It's a different test, but they just have to spit into this tube, package it up. The kit comes with a FedEx envelope that is pre-addressed, so they just drop it off at a FedEx center, and then we usually have a result in less than a month.
So how accurate are the genetic tests? And is it possible that something runs in your family, but it doesn't show up in your genetic testing?
The tests are very accurate for what they're testing. So for instance, we are looking at the 77 cancer genes. Those genes are being sequenced, and they're looking essentially for what are typos in the genes. And that process is very accurate. However, there are genes that we don't yet know about. And so there are families that will have a strong family history of cancer. We will test for everything that we can at this point in time, and they still come back negative. And so for those families, I suspect there could still be a hereditary predisposition, but when the genetic test comes back negative, what it means is that either they have a change in a gene that isn't detectable by the current testing methodology, and that's rare, by the way, but it does happen, or they have a change in a gene we're not even testing for yet because we don't know about it yet. Breast cancer genes are very well understood. The test is pretty good for those, but for colon conditions, polyposis conditions, that's when you have a lot of polyps in your colon that's found during a colonoscopy. A lot of other cancers, the rare cancers like gastric cancer, we don't know all the genetic causes yet. So it's not a perfect test.
Okay.
And it is possible that we're missing genes still. So the recommendation is if you have a strong family history and your test comes back negative, we want to reevaluate every couple of years and maybe retest every few years as the technology gets better.
And can you just clarify, will genetics tests tell you if you have a disease or just if you're at risk for it?
It does not diagnose disease. If you already have a cancer and your genetic test comes back positive, presumably that positive gene, whatever gene is identified plays a role, but that's not necessarily the case. So a genetic test does not diagnose disease. It only tells you if you have a predisposition to the disease. You can live your whole life with say a BRCA2 mutation. It's the new terminology is variant, pathogenic variant. You can have that condition and never get cancer. In fact, I have women in my clinic who we've been following for a while who tested positive and they've never had any cancer, and some of them are in their 70s. That's a good point to bring up, though, because a positive gene test does not mean you have disease. It only means you have a higher than average risk to get certain types of cancers. So we need to start screening.
And this screening is a one and done. You don't have to come back later and get more genetic testing done. Only if they discover things.
Yeah, it can be. Sometimes it's the case where we do repeat testing because the technology has gotten better and better every few years. So for instance, if you are a woman who was tested prior to say 2015, and you were only tested for a few genes at the time you were tested, we would recommend retesting now because we're testing for more genes and the sequencing technology is much better and more sensitive. So we're picking up more genetic alterations that would have been missed before.
Okay. Well, we are at the end of our chat time. I want to thank you, Karen, for being here, answering these questions. It's been a very informative and interesting discussion. Want to remind everybody to join us for our next Doc Talk Live, which will be on January 19th. And Dr. Melissa Loja, a vascular surgeon at NorthBay, will be discussing aortic